Great. So thank you so much, Ellie, and to RMIT and everyone who has contributed to this event. It's been an awesome couple of days here in Melbourne. If we haven't had the chance to meet yet, my name is Kaitlin, and I currently lead protocol governance for the Filecoin ecosystem. And so to introduce this idea of governance surfaces and institutions, I want to welcome you all back from lunch with a tale of drama and intrigue and conflict from the Filecoin ecosystem, with a focus specifically on how we've recently experienced some governance failures and how we've felt those specifically in sort of the social and political layers of our governance ecosystem. So for those of you who may not be familiar, the Filecoin protocol is the sibling protocol of IPFS, and it exists to provide a decentralized layer for the internet's data storage. Filecoin was originally built a few years ago. The mainnet launch of the protocol was just about 2 years ago. And it was built by a man named Juan Benet and his company Protocol Labs, an organization that's still very much involved in the day-to-day operations of Filecoin. I, however, work for the Filecoin Foundation. Down here on the bottom is our team's mission statement and what we try to do. And like other low-layer utility protocols, we have this sort of hybrid system where we have a foundation structure, we have an engineering arm. All of this is enmeshed within a much broader community. And overall, what we're trying to negotiate when we think of governance is a really complex system of stakeholders and a very complex tech stack that need to work together in order to innovate, but also remain committed to these principles of openness and decentralization that have brought many of our contributors to this ecosystem in the first place. So oftentimes when we think of governance in decentralized ecosystems, we think it's synonymous with DAOs or with on-chain governance, and we tend to assume there is a particular technocratic angle to the way we do things. But it is important to remember that open ecosystems in software and technology are not just 5 or 10 years old, they are decades old, and that open source software foundations have been finding ways to govern open source protocols and platforms for a very, very long time. So what you have when you have incredibly complex ecosystems, things which need to govern really intense design decisions, engineering or technocratic problems, or otherwise which are asking a community to deliberate on things which have really high expertise requirements for engagement, sometimes reducing things to a vote or aligning your tokenomic structure with governance decision is not always the most efficient or productive way of actually making an open and reliable community process for decision making. So what Filecoin does is it's adopted the legacy of other and older open source software foundations. We actually are a direct legacy descendant of the Ethereum Improvement Proposals process. And what we've put in place is called the Filecoin Improvement Proposals process, an off-chain system of proposals that anyone, regardless of whether you hold Filecoin tokens, regardless of whether you're in our Discord or our Slack channels or anything else, is able to go in, make a proposal, ask a question, engage in this process of iterative technical design, and otherwise opt in to Filecoin protocol governance as their interest and expertise allows. What this means is that we have an incredibly soft governing process, right? It is guided by stakeholders who are experts in what they do. And what we focus on is not achieving proactive consent to make protocol choices, but on soft or rough consensus around what should or should not be a priority for our ecosystem. Now, this can be a really good governing model when you are trying to make decisions really, really fast. When you have governance that is a deep community function and isn't readily accessible to a broad group of stakeholders. Again, if you are working in a DeFi organization, in a DAO, in a social DAO, you may be asked to make decisions about what you should fund or whether one thing should be more of a priority over another. But what we're asking the Filecoin community to govern is the ideal type of systems architecture for a native Ethereum-compatible virtual machine. We want to know if there are new account abstraction methods or new proof methods or new protocol mechanism actions that we should be designing, and if so, how? And so what we've decided or created is this really kind of social layer for governance that is soft, that sort of excludes people, again, based on expertise, but says if you're here and if you're contributing, we are going to make sure everything is openly documented, publicly iterated, that anyone can ask questions and stop this acceptance process. But when it comes time to actually decide what goes on the network, we're not going to ask a bunch of people to raise their hands and say yes or no. We're going to kind of poll the sense of the room, right? This is a legacy of earlier projects, which maybe didn't have a ton of contributors at first. And we're going to make decisions that allow us to govern in a relatively low friction way. Okay? Great. Nice. Awesome. Sounds nice. But there's a really obvious flaw here. And the flaw is that what happens when you don't actually have soft consensus and all of these experts in the room don't actually agree on what you ought to do? Filecoin's governing documents, we do have a constitution that was created when the Filecoin mainnet launched. But they couldn't predict the future, and it was designed based on best practice and what we had at the moment. And as is often the case for governance, which tends to be a very transdisciplinary practice on the fringe edge of decentralized operations, is that we often are in this position where we're having to account for scenarios that we didn't really anticipate having to account for. And we're having to do it on a timeline that in crypto you can never predict. So what happened was a couple of months ago, we got a proposal, FIP 36. It was proposed in June of this year and formally rejected by the community in October. But in the 5 months that passed, we had more engagement and more demand for governance than ever before. All of a sudden, we have an intensity of momentum around robust governing processes, not that could sort of help us iterate and come up with a better design for the cryptoeconomic problem that this FIP proposed to address, but one that could deliver us hard consensus on something that was fundamentally existential. We went from being this nascent community protocol that was just trying to innovate very rapidly to having a core group of researchers assert that there was a fundamental problem with a relatively philosophical component of how this entire ecosystem works. And they were asking our soft consensus governing layer to make a decision about what should happen. And you can probably imagine that what happened was not actually a coherent answer, but it was thousands and thousands of comments in a GitHub repo and fears that the network would actually not be able to make a decision in a legitimate way, which is a very nice way of saying I was very, very stressed out for a couple of months. So what did we do? Well, as is usually the case with governance, we had to spring into action, do the best that we thought, and what that ended up looking like was a community poll. Like I said, we oftentimes think of polling as synonymous with governance in decentralized organizations, but it shouldn't be. And one of the most exciting things that we learned through this process, even though there were many hard lessons, is that our initial assumptions about sort of the form of governance in ecosystems should never be assumed. Because we launched a community poll, here's what it looked like, here's a screenshot of the board that we put together. You probably can't learn anything from this because even the dashboard outcome was incredibly complicated. We ran feedback surveys after this and found that our community thought that this poll was one of the worst governing decisions that we had made as an ecosystem. They didn't see it as legitimate. They would agree with the answer that we gave them, broadly speaking. But also what you can probably see is that this was definitively rejected by those who voted, and most people, as you can see by these gray lines, didn't vote at all. Very, very classic mechanism design failure for something that is presumed to be easy, but is actually quite complicated. And it reinforced this idea that we had that if we are not taking into account the ways that people make decisions in complicated and ever-evolving ecosystems, we are not going to be able to provide technical solutions that make these problems go away. We're going to hide them and not be able to address complexity as these ecosystems scale. So fortunately for us, we were able to weather this system shock, which is great because other ecosystems have had similar problems and have not been able to do so. And it's because what we realized is that even though we weren't accounting for every eventuality in our current governing model, we had a certain amount of resiliency that allowed us to sort of make reactive changes and now look back in hindsight, learn from it, and propose ways to move forward with this entire group of decentralized stakeholders. But what I really want to reiterate once again is that when we are thinking about governance broadly, it is important that we recognize how multifaceted the components of these interactions are, and that they shouldn't be subsumed to a single technology, a single model, or a single way of doing things, because they are complicated. And even in organizations or DAOs, which are smaller than Filecoins, that are less complicated, or exist to be fundamentally transactional, you still have a fundamental social and political layer whenever anyone is being asked to opt into something and make a decision as part of a collective group. So I leave you with some of the key learnings that we had from this. I want to touch specifically on the one that says group consensus and individual responsibility can be substitute goods in times of crisis. This is one that my colleagues are sick of hearing because I run around and yell at them all of the time. But I think it really speaks to this idea, again, also as we're designing systems, that decentralization is not a binary. You are not decentralized or not decentralized. It is a spectrum of decision making and design that we are all working through. And today, the last 2 days that we've had separate workshops here in Melbourne, and going forward in the years to come, I think it's important that folks remain open-minded and creative and realize that decentralization is something that we're all working towards as we build these ecosystems. And it's not a one-size-fits-all model that anyone purports to know at this point in time. So, thank you.
He's going to be on screen soon.
Great. All right.
We'll bring up Michael Zargha, otherwise known as just Zargha or Z, who is the founder and CEO of BlockScience, a really important research organization doing a lot of work around systems design, complexity science. He's pioneered so many different designs, systems, and even ethnographic ways of thinking about blockchains. So we're very, very pleased to have him here speaking to us tonight for him. Take it away, Z.
Hey, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Just quick confirmation.
Yes.
Great. So I'm going to be talking about algorithms as policy, and I'm going to be coming at this from the perspective as a sort of systems engineer and sort of a control theorist or algorithmic policymaker, as it were. And I'm going to jump into that topic by reminding everyone of this meme, code is law, and then quickly sort of debunking it insofar as the term got very popular within crypto circles in like an evocation of this idea that you kind of make the rules, you put them in code, and then they're immutable and you can't change them, or that they should be treated somehow as a doctrine. And what I think most people have learned over the last 3 to 5 years is that that kind of pure immutability just doesn't stand up to reality. And so I'm sort of offering this alternative turn of phrase, algorithms as policy, with no disservice to Lawrence Lessig's original quote, because when he talked about code as law in his work on code and other laws of cyberspace, he actually described something that's a little bit closer, probably a lot closer to what we're talking about today, which is algorithms as embodiments of sort of regulating processes that are not actually permanent, that they can be adapted to purpose, to context, etc. For our work, we've sort of decomposed systems in a variety of ways, and I happen to like this diagram from a paper that I worked on with Sherman Vossinger some years ago on a complex systems perspective for cryptoeconomics, and really emphasizing this decomposition between sort of the human and machine elements. So in the upper left, the left and top, we have sort of humans and governance processes, which sort of represent the individual level human decision making, say interactions with software or participation within governance, and the sort of group level decision making, which we can think of as governance, whether it's soft like Kaitlin was talking about, or harder in the sense of using mechanisms on chain to vote on processes which are whose outcomes are automated according to the vote's outcomes. That's nonetheless part of a social process, and we affect changes on algorithms, or what I've called algorithmic policies, which are like the internal business logics of these software, which are actually distinct from potentially user-facing software or apps that we interact with. Now, in practice, these things might be relatively tightly coupled, the algorithmic policies or business policies and the software, DApp or otherwise, that a user interacts with, but by pulling them apart, the logic and the plant or the system we interact with, we can be a little clearer about the way this breaks down. So I view this lower right-hand quadrant as automation. It's where the logics determine what will happen if the system or the DApp is in a current state and you act upon it in a certain way. It's going to drive specific interactions. And we automate this. We say, if this happens, then that happens. And that provides a degree of confidence, actually, much like the lawyers in the earlier session discussed. That's distinct from the interactions that humans take on their own decisions, and I tend to bucket this into operations. It's day-to-day activities within the scope of the rules put forth by the software or embodied in the software. And then we have this concept of the governance surface, which is basically how those affordances get changed by governance. So various ways in which the governance processes, soft or hard, can modify these policies or this shared technical substrate. And then finally, we have our equivalent of civic engagement in these digital systems. So the reality check, which we very nicely got from Kaitlin, is that pretty much no matter what this is, it's going to be a bit of a dumpster fire. And I like to harken back to a lot of Eric's work on governance as conflict to highlight the fact that this isn't necessarily bad. This is governance working as intended, because there's always going to be some margins for disagreement amongst the members within a group. And if you don't have governance processes, or excuse me, if you don't have those conflicts, you don't need those governance processes. They exist in part to transform that disagreement into effective, or at least like viable, decision making. So if I wanted to zoom out a little bit and just think about a DAO in a very cartoonish way, we've got members and smart contracts, or members and technologies, which are importing some resources, including the time and attention, potentially funding, and exporting something, say open source software, or a shared public digital infrastructure like Filecoin. And the rest of the world is essentially consuming these hopefully positive externalities, and in some way, including the members themselves, importing this attention and this effort and funding where needed. Which gives us an opportunity to look quickly at, like, well, what is this policy making, or this algorithmic policy making giving us? Well, it's giving us a bridge between this desirable system level behavior and the incentivized or made possible individual level behavior. And this is actually a link back to some of Jason's work on the sort of micro, meso, macro view of institutional economics. Given the shortness of the talk, I'm probably not going to dive into too much detail about this, but I think it's important to recognize that there are different scales here. There's the outside world and there's the inside world, and policymaking is part of how we make a bridge between this broader systems view, this behavior of the aggregate, and the micro or individual level view, or the behavior of the individual. And we actually want to enfranchise people within that process in order to create something that's functionally democratic, not just sort of democratic in procedure. Like, we experience input into the processes that govern us. However, in practice, that can get quite messy. And when we start to see DAOs using smart contract-based governance mechanisms, they're actually, again, they're using two systems at the same time. One set of smart contracts that governs their day-to-day activities, and those are the things the DAO is meant to empower or enable, and another set that makes these decisions about how to change policies, maybe to vote to upgrade smart contracts, change inflation rates where there are tokens with inflation schedules, anything of that manner. And actually, I would include within this purview of governance smart contracts just governance processes, policies, rules, norms, deliberation procedures, etc., that ultimately give rise to changes of the field of action in which the members participate. And this can actually have bearing, and should be expected to have bearing, on the rest of the world, whether that would be other smart contracts and other software systems, or just other people. In an effort to make this adaptable while also still constraining the degrees of adaptation, to strike a balance between confidence that things will continue to work how they work now and the ability to adapt to future uncertainties that, like, you can't enumerate at the time that you design one of these institutions, we've developed this concept of a constitutional archetype, and it appears in a paper that I co-authored with Kelsey on aligning DAOs to precedents in cybernetics. But at the end of the day, what we really care about as participants in DAOs, at least, is whether the resources that we are bringing to the DAO are being used effectively. So I'm going to kind of close out my talk by providing a relatively simple heuristic, which I call return on attention, which is to say that while most DAOs or many DAOs have treasuries and they talk about a lot about return on investment of their funds, in reality, funds are generally used to buy time and attention of contributors. They're used to pay out those contributors according to some metrics. But if we think about it that way, then it's actually the attention that's the very valuable, likely non-fungible, where expertise is concerned, resource. And so what I would like to see both designers and participants alike thinking about with their DAO governance models is more about how to make the voluntarily granted attention of the contributors to these DAOs have the highest return on attention possible. And that doesn't necessarily mean generation of income. Depending on the purpose of the DAO in question, it may mean a variety of different things, from the quality of the open source software or research produced to just delivering back to those same members a positive experience like a club might in a more traditional setting. So thank you very much for having me. That is the end of my talk.
Thank you, Zargha, and please stay online for our Q&A. But next, I'd like to introduce Kelsey Navin from the RMIT Blockchain Innovation Hub.
All right, thank you so much. So I get to bring some alpha for you today. So this is some very initial findings from my PhD, which is the last kind of 2.5 years of deep hanging out in decentralized technology projects and communities that was preceded by more than that for a few years, which helped kind of inform some of this research. And so I should give credit to Ellie Rennie as well as Chris Berg, who's in the audience, who are my supervisors, potentially as well as Michael Zargha, who is a colleague and collaborator. And I don't know if I appointed him or he appointed himself or he appointed me, but he's also like a pseudo research mind. And now I do some things with BlockScience as well. And so I'm going to try to propose a framework or put language to what Kaitlin and Zargha have been describing around this creation of governance processes, the human and machine components that go into that, as well as the attempt to make it resilient, whatever that means. Oh, it's going to be a phased approach. Here we go. All right, too far. All right, so still. Okay, so what I call this, out of my findings on my PhD on what is resilience in decentralized technologies, is this phenomenon of self-infrastructuring. And self-infrastructuring is when people are able to participate in the design, development, operation, maintenance of their own infrastructure. And now what I point out is that this comes from kind of a deep political ideology. I start my research in the kind of history of decentralized technology communities, specifically looking at a countercultural subgroup in the 1990s that emerged called the cypherpunks. And this idea of self-governance as a way of kind of emancipation or prefiguring their own agenda. And so what I argue is that what's actually going on in terms of governance and resilience in decentralized technologies is this ability for people to place boundaries around their own actions. And actually when there's misalignment between the purpose of a community and the kind of technical or institutional and social implementation of that action, then resilience breaks down or potentially fails. So self-infrastructuring emerges from this collective will to adapt and continue to self-govern. And here I'm thinking about resilience as adaptability and transformability in relation to purpose. So it can be both kind of a positive or an opportunistic aspiration, as well as in response to threat or crisis. And so partly resilience has to do with how well people can collectively articulate their political objectives, identify what their threat models are, even identify who is the community. And that's come up in our workshops on what's governing Web3 in the last 3 days. So what are the actual rules or the boundaries of membership in these, permissionless, pseudonymous online communities? And then adapt in line with these objectives. And so how is this occurring in practice in decentralized technologies communities? Well, I look at 3 major case studies in my work. The first is a DAO, a decentralized autonomous organization, and I specifically did a long form study into Gitcoin DAO. And I looked at how the DAO, as a centralized project with founders, more like a traditional startup, wanted to transition ownership and operation of that organization, which provides funding to open source software projects. How do they actually defend themselves against Sybil attacks, which are fake online identities trying to game the funding system? And so here's a diagram from some work that was done in BlockScience, and the way that I actually observed this was through first-hand participation in the DAO, as well as in my kind of informal research collaboration at the time with BlockScience, who was contracted to help design and implement a machine learning pipeline that could detect potential Sybil attackers. And so I talk about this governance of algorithms and governance by algorithms. That's something that Zargha kind of brought up in his discussion on algorithms as policy, and what's actually the role and the hierarchy of humans and machines in these systems, and how do you get accountability, but then also operational efficiency of such kind of complex processes. This is a very beautiful image of an open source hardware microchip. And this section of my research I talk about as full stack self-infrastructuring. So there's projects trying to go not only in kind of software or in cyberspace as cypherpunks did in the 1990s, but to think about the physical materialities of decentralized technologies and how people might be able to create resilience for themselves by self-infrastructuring in those settings as well. And so this project called Kongland is a self-professed crypto state that is manufacturing these chips. So not only do they have these kind of ideological aspirations and this identity around kind of, sovereignty down to the physical level, but then they also need to deal with real world supply chains. And so they've got, organizational and operational kind of infrastructure or institutional infrastructure to create those systems and those structures around self-governing and self-infrastructuring their own hardware. And then finally, this is a hand-drawn diagram by myself of some work that I did on decentralized data storage. And I looked at IPFS, which I don't know if Kaitlin touched on today, but it's kind of referred to as kind of a sister protocol to Filecoin. So it's how you address content or data online in a decentralized way before putting it on Filecoin or another sort of storage solution. And what I looked at was how people self-infrastructure in practice. And sometimes, again, coming to that misalignment between technical implementations of self-infrastructuring and purpose, the different ways that people were actually implementing their storage solutions in line with their local context. And so those are the 3 areas that I wanted to bring you today. I really hope that this kind of lens of self-infrastructuring resonates in the way that you can think about Web3 governance and resilience today. And then I want to kind of leave you with something further. So What I then do in my work is attune my ethnographic sensibilities to the future, to postulate on self-infrastructuring as a meme and as a future, or to unfix and unsettle this concept by considering coexisting infrastructural possibilities of a centralized web and a self-infrastructuring web in the digital and materialities of our everyday experiences. So what that means in non-kind of ethnographic academic speak, to Eric's point, is part of what we're talking about today is two kind of possible alternative but coexisting digital realities or digital economies or whatever lens you want to use, where self-infrastructuring opportunities exist and where centralized kind of web as we know opportunities exist. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to call Kaitlin back. Here she comes. And Zargha back on the screen, please. So who's going to kick off questions for this session? I feel like I hogged it last time. Great. Anna, thank you. We need to wait for a working microphone. Apologies, everyone.
Hi.
Okay. Yeah, let's get that second one down. Thanks.
Sorry. Does this work? Okay. Kaitlin, I was struck you introduced your talk as a governance failure. And I want to push back on that and say that it wasn't a failure because you're still standing, right? It was maybe a crisis moment or a difficulty, but yeah, just if you have something to say about, reflecting on that.
Sorry, Ellie. I actually couldn't have planted a better question. You're totally right. It was not a failure because the system proved to be resilient enough to withstand. And to this idea of governance momentum, which I mentioned, it's important that you have these tipping points, right? So that you can iterate new designs. Additionally, I will say that, I mentioned we had this voting procedure we put in place very haphazardly. And I think in certain ways that was not as successful an option as we could have put in place. But it also created the conditions for us to actually reject our first ever community proposal, which previously there's no real reason why that would have happened. So you're right, in a lot of ways it was a success. We just don't feel that always when you're in the community trying to make decisions. But thank you.
Question for all the panelists. I'm 15 years post-admission as a lawyer, if I remember correctly, and thinking as an economist side of things, there's often an assumption about rational actors in the field. How much of this can be derailed by the lack of rational actors or the groupthink propensity, because DAOs do, and some of the other stuff in this space can lend itself to being vulnerable to certain structures being overthrown by people who either think they're acting in their own interests but aren't, or people who are simply acting in their own interest at the cost of everyone else, often duplicitously.
I don't mind starting off if that's okay, guys. Yeah.
Go for it.
So I think the first challenge is the recognizing that the rational actor frame of reference can be a bit misleading. As a designer, it's really tempting to say or to suppose that you know what is in the best interest of the participants within these systems. But in practice, a governance system has to process signal from the participants within that process into beliefs, preferences, and decisions. And so I think that the first thing to do is to broaden the scope of the formal representation away from one where the designer of the protocol or the designer of the governance mechanisms presuppose that they know what's best for all of the participants. That's not to say that we should completely remove the notion of acting in one's own interest or within the group's best interest. It doesn't go away entirely, but I think more often than not, breakdowns that in that way of thinking start from being a little too forward about the designer's belief that they know what's best for the participants.
Can we get this mic on, please?
Thanks. Yeah, I'll just add to that. I guess from an ethnographic perspective, I'm not assuming anyone is rational when I'm looking at these things. It's observing what happens in practice, as you learned yesterday from the digital ethnography workshops. But I think there's a helpful phrase by Stafford Beer that a system's purpose is what it does. So it's not even about what people say in interview, but again, that like kind of real world, like in practice experience when these things are at play.
Yeah, and I think in just the case of our ecosystem, because we don't have these token-driven governance models, what we end up seeing is we collectively have this assumption of the rational actor when we design our cryptoeconomic system or propose cryptoeconomic changes. And as we saw in the FIP36 case, since that was a proposed cryptoeconomic change, it's governance where we actually go to adjudicate that assumption and figure out how community members are actually reacting to presuppositions. Yep.
I think now is a good time that I want to ask my question about motivation and motivation theories in a way. It was relevant in the first set of speakers, and I think it's also really a good follow-up to the question about rational actors, and that is, okay, and I'm coming from and this isn't where I'm sitting now, but I'm an old school, in some boxes, management theorist. So what we know after 50 years of studying motivation is that we don't know what motivates people, right? There are no working, effective theories of motivation in the world. So one of the things that is so central that is being brought up again and again is the importance of motivation. And I'm wondering if you have any examples of cases where first it works, like whatever motivation is working over a sustainable period of time. So we know that and then I think that the other thing I wanted to just sort of wonder is, can we get beyond the intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation label? Because I think what's happening here is a lot more complex, and it's trying to also be between the kind of formal organization, which is using like carrot and stick, to put it simply, as motivational tools, and informal organizations which tend to either fall apart or become hierarchical over time as a natural process, right? So or maybe that's part of the entropy of the system in a way. And so are there examples that you have encountered that might help us crack the nut of the motivation problem? And I'm thinking about, Michael, your notion of attention, but before you get to attention, you have to get motivation to, maintain attention. Anyway, I wondered if any of you have some good examples.
Did you want to start, Z?
Yeah, I have an example. It's not actually from the Web3 domain. It's from open source software development, and in particular from the sort of data science world. But I'll broaden it out a bit. So having worked on, used and worked on some tools in data science open source software, my recurring observed pattern looks something like early projects are generated extremely intrinsically motivated by creative types who just want to build the thing, probably because they want to use it or their friends want to use it, and there's a initial surge of energy in a small group. And at that moment and in that early phase, the motivation takes this intrinsic form. But as time goes on and other people start consuming it, then they have a lower and lower sort of incentive because they've sort of done the creative work and they don't really want to do the scaling and or maintenance type work. And so as you shift to supporting a much larger group of users, you're going to see loss of motivation on the part of people, or maybe it's better to understand that the needs of that project have moved away from the things that that group of people is motivated to do. And so then you get a different kind of motivation that drives, often for people who are just interested in scaling, or people who have really high code quality standards and just want to do the work to improve the maintainability and the usability at scale. But then even after that, there's another phase, which is more like ongoing maintenance and care, which is still yet another kind of work. And as a result, different kinds of people are motivated to do it. And even worse, that kind of ongoing maintenance is often thankless, and it sort of shifts into a phase where you really do need some financial incentives to get people motivated to stick with it. And so if you look at that cycle, what my takeaway has been is that organizations evolve over their life cycle, the work that is required changes, thus the things that people are motivated to do change, and the nature of whether that motivation is intrinsic or more extrinsic, like in the case of shifting to maybe even if it's donation-based compensation for work that isn't necessarily something that anyone just wants to do, but needs to be done in order to maintain the software quality. When I look at that, though, I just really want to emphasize the fact that, motivation, like many things we talk about, is likely to be extremely context dependent and purpose specific, and specific to purpose, or even specific to the relationship between the people, the work that needs to be done, and the purpose it's intended to achieve. And that would be a good reason why there wouldn't be a, sort of single solution to how do you motivate people. You need to be able to keep track of situationally, even for the same organization, these different relationships, which are effectively always moving targets.
Back. Yeah, I'm back. I guess just to add to what Zargha has said, perhaps a more kind of cultural observation, like crypto or Web3 that we're speaking about as a generalization is very tribal. And so you can kind of perhaps kind of look into different corners to understand different motivations a little bit better. So some examples is like there's like the self-proclaimed like DeFi degens, so decentralized finance degenerates. And they're, probably like a more particular kind of demographic, motivated by kind of money. They're like the more kind of pyramid scheme type, like hype, get people in, make money. We all know it's going to crash at some point, but like, try to get rich quick. Then there's regen, so regenerative finance, and that's this fairly nascent kind of Web3 tribe around sort of sustainable cryptoeconomic models that are, good for economy and kind of environment, and how do you create more regenerative futures, I guess. And then there's others again, like decentralized science. So that's probably more about like an intellectual motivation and just like a, hyper kind of brain-led curiosity. And they're the more people pushing on the like longevity and transhumanist kind of thing about like, let's integrate with machines and like, let's fund, longevity research and, test biolinks and all these things. So I think you can definitely break down motivations, and it's possible to kind of identify those tribes, and maybe that's an in to those cultures and to understanding motivation a little bit better.